Judge Porter's words rang out in the courtroom, chilling and final. You're fined $15,000, effective immediately. This hearing is over. They landed like a bombshell, detonating in the center of the room. For a brief moment, everything seemed to freeze. No one moved. The tapping of the court clerk's keyboard ceased. There was no sound, only a thick, oppressive silence hanging in the air. Judge Richard Porter didn't flinch. His voice as flat and emotionless as though he were merely placing an order for lunch. No explanation was offered, no evidence presented, no trial had taken place. Just an arbitrary ruling from the bench, as though his authority alone could rewrite reality. Olivia Carson remained seated at the defense table, her fingers lightly pressing against the surface, but the coldness she felt wasn't from the dull, gray walls or the faint buzzing of the overhead fluorescent lights. No, it came from something else, something far deeper. It was a raw abuse of power, wielded so recklessly and openly in a public space. She stood slowly, not to argue, at least not yet, but to mark the shift in the room's energy. It was as if she were reclaiming her presence in a place that had suddenly felt designed to erase her. Your Honor, she said, her voice measured and respectful. This hearing hasn't even begun. Judge Porter leaned forward, elbows planted on the bench, his gaze unyielding. There's no need for beginning, he said. The violation is clear, and so is the penalty. The gallery behind her stirred, a murmur of disbelief rippling through the room. Even the opposing counsel, a young assistant city attorney named Davis, shifted uneasily in his seat. This was no ordinary case. This was a violation of constitutional rights. Yet no one dared speak up. Olivia Carson inhaled slowly, her mind racing. She had known there would be friction. Silver Creek's municipal court was infamous for its lack of decorum. But this was something else entirely. It wasn't just unexpected. It was an ambush, a hammer blow, before anyone had even been given the chance to speak. Still, she wasn't shocked. She had done her research. Judge Porter had a history. Sweeping decisions delivered without hearings, no discovery, no due process, just a string of fines over the past year. No one had challenged him, until now. She glanced briefly at the court clerk, then at the gallery, feeling the weight of their gaze on her. They were watching, recording every word. This wasn't just a hearing. It was a setup, but what Porter didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Olivia Carson had come prepared for war. She stepped forward, her tone unwavering, still respectful. Your Honor, I am here on a procedural matter. The city citation lacks evidence, witness corroboration, and any documentation to substantiate the alleged violation. Judge Porter's eyes narrowed. You've already said that, he snapped, his voice cold. You're wasting this court's time. Olivia didn't flinch. Due process isn't a waste of time. The judge's fist slammed onto the table, hard enough to make the surface rattle. It wasn't a gavel, but it was enough to make the room jump. This isn't your stage, Miss Carson, he said sharply. And I'm not here to entertain speeches. The fine stands. If you want to appeal, you can try, but it won't get far. And there it was, a twist, not just a ruling, but a threat, a warning to sit down, be quiet, and know your place. You don't belong here. But Olivia Carson didn't sit down. She didn't remain quiet. She stood her ground, her gaze locking with his. In that moment, something shifted. The silence wasn't one of submission. It was pressure, like the moments before a dam breaks. Her hands remained at her sides, but her words cut through the tension like a blade. You're not just violating procedure, she said, her voice quiet but firm. You're using the law to silence people. And that's not authority. That's abuse. The courtroom held its breath. Gasps rippled across the back row as Davis sat up straight, blinking in disbelief, unable to fathom what he was hearing. Bren, he muttered, flinching for a split second. It was just enough for Olivia Carson to know she'd struck a nerve, but he quickly masked it, straightening his robe and forcing a smug half-smile. You're out of order, Davis said. Olivia nodded calmly. And you're out of line. Another silence descended on the room. Slowly, Olivia opened her case file and laid a stack of documents on the table. Precedents, citations, federal case law. She had them all meticulously prepared, each page highlighted and organized. She knew today would come. She knew she'd be underestimated, and that was exactly why she had come as a public defender. Unannounced, low profile, no flashy firm, no press. Just a black woman with a briefcase and the memory of every client she'd seen crushed by men like Judge Porter. She turned to gallery, her voice steady. "There are people," she said, "who have lost homes, businesses, and their freedom because of decisions like this. No hearing, no proof, just a voice on the bench saying, 'I've decided.' This is not justice. This is control." Judge Porter cut in sharply, his voice slicing through the air. "This isn't a lecture hall." Olivia didn't flinch. "Then stop treating it like a stage and show me the law." The clerk's fingers froze above the keyboard. The room went still once more. Olivia Carson met the judge's eyes again, her voice unwavering. "Find me if you want," she said, "but I promise you, every word spoken in this room is being recorded. Every document you refuse to acknowledge will be on the record, and every abuse of authority will be brought to light. Because I'm not here just to argue, I'm here to expose." Judge Porter stood, his face reddening. "I'm calling a recess," he barked, but it was too late. The room wasn't listening to him anymore. They were listening to her. For the first time all morning, Judge Harold Porter looked like a man losing control of his own courtroom. Olivia Carson remained standing, unmoved as he disappeared through the chamber door. She didn't blink. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. The recess clock ticked away, each second a countdown. Olivia stood alone at the defense table, her hands calmly resting on the leather edge of her folder. She didn't check her phone. She didn't glance at the gallery. She simply waited because she knew exactly what Judge Porter was doing behind that door. He wasn't reviewing the case. He was calling for backup, and he was scared. She could feel it in the air, the way the gallery buzzed with murmurs just beneath the threshold of speech. The prosecutor hadn't said a word, but the way his knees bounced nervously under the table betrayed his unease. The court clerk kept glancing at Olivia Carson, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. Even the bailiff stood a little straighter. 15 minutes. That's what Porter had bought himself. But Olivia Carson knew that when a man like him retreats, he's not coming back alone. And he didn't. The door to the judge's chambers creaked open with stiff reluctance. First came Porter. His face paler than before, his jaw clenched even tighter. But trailing behind him was another figure. Taller, older, slower, but somehow more imposing. His robe moved with a kind of weight that made the air feel heavier. Olivia Carson recognized him instantly. Judge Samuel Hayes, senior circuit judge with federal oversight. Known in the Eastern legal world for his brutal attention to detail and unyielding courtroom control, Judge Hayes was not someone you invited into a local courtroom unless things were completely spinning out of control. And clearly, they were. The entire room shifted, not out of respect, but out of anticipation. Samuel Hayes' gaze was piercing as he surveyed the scene. His gaze swept over the courtroom like a searchlight, pausing on Olivia Carson longer than most judges ever did. He wasn't just observing her posture. He was calculating everything, her eye contact, breath, rhythm, assessing whether she was confident or merely bluffing. Judge Porter cleared his throat and walked to the bench. "For the record," he began, "I've asked Judge Samuel Hayes to observe today's proceedings, as certain procedural questions have arisen." A ripple of confusion spread across the gallery, but Judge Hayes remained silent, simply taking a seat to the side of the bench. His mere presence shifted the atmosphere of the room. Olivia Carson stood her ground, not out of stubbornness, but with purpose. She wasn't the one on trial anymore. She had forced the system to look at itself. Finally, Samuel Hayes spoke. His voice was deep and deliberate, measured with no wasted syllables. "Miss Carson, you've raised constitutional concerns. I'd like you to restate your core objection for the record." She nodded and responded, her voice calm but firm, the kind that doesn't need to be loud to carry weight. "Yes, Your Honor." The fine imposed by Judge Porter was delivered without evidentiary review, without witness testimony, and without a procedural hearing. I was given no opportunity to present an argument, examine evidence, or challenge the citation. That is not due process. That is summary punishment. Porter shifted in his seat, but remained silent. Samuel Hayes' fingers steepled slowly, his gaze never wavering. Do you have legal precedent to support your claim? Olivia Carson opened her folder, as if cracking open a vault. Yes, beginning with Sullivan v. State of Illinois, 2017. A municipal citation was issued without inspection reports or photos, just the officer's written statement. The fine was reversed on appeal, with the court ruling that assumption cannot replace process. She paused, her gaze steady. The second is Henderson v. City of St. Petersburg, 2019, where the court found that fines issued without verifiable evidence were void under constitutional scrutiny. Samuel Hayes' head tilted ever so slightly, signaling that he was listening, really listening. Porter, however, was no longer pretending to command the room. He sat stiff, like a passenger bracing for impact. Samuel nodded slowly. Thank you, Miss Carson. He turned to Porter. Judge, was the defendant afforded an opportunity to contest the citation prior to your ruling? Porter's mouth twitched, but he remained silent. The violation was clear, he muttered. The code speaks for itself. Samuel Hayes didn't blink. That wasn't my question. Porter hesitated. No formal argument was heard. A long pause followed before Samuel's voice broke the silence, soft yet laden with the quiet menace of a man accustomed to ending careers with a silence. That is deeply troubling. Porter looked as though he might object, but no words came. Olivia Carson stepped forward again, her resolve unwavering. I would like to call the issuing officer to the stand. Samuel Hayes looked at Porter. Is the officer present? From the back of the room, Porter muttered, Yes. A uniformed man rose, broad-shouldered, clean-cut, walking with the self-assurance of someone who had never been questioned. Officer Clifford Reynolds took the oath without flinching, settling into the witness box as though it were a throne. Olivia Carson approached slowly, her steps deliberate. Officer Reynolds, she began, her voice measured, you issued the citation against me for violating Municipal Code 32C, correct? Yes, ma'am, he replied confidently. And the violation you claim to have witnessed, she continued. Did you photograph it? No need, he said, shrugging. It was obvious. Did you write a report? No. Any diagram? Any witnesses? Olivia pressed. The silence stretched across the room as Olivia Carson waited, her gaze steady and unwavering. Finally, she spoke, calmly and without hesitation. Do you have any physical evidence to support your accusation? Officer Reynolds bristled at the challenge. I've been doing this for 22 years. My word is enough. There it was, the arrogance. Olivia Carson nodded slightly, acknowledging his experience, but quickly dismantling his defense. Your experience isn't in question, but your evidence is, she replied, turning to the bench. Your honors, what we have here is not enforcement, it's assumption. The officer made a judgment without documentation, and Judge Porter issued a fine without due process. That's not justice. That's unchecked authority. Reynolds leaned forward, scowling. I don't need a camera to know what I saw. But we do, Olivia Carson countered, her voice as sharp as steel. Because what you saw may be your truth, but in this courtroom, we don't convict on feelings. We convict on facts. Judge Samuel Hayes' voice cut through the tension, soft but final. I've heard enough now. The room fell into a hushed silence again. Porter remained unmoved. But Olivia Carson stood tall, a single figure against the weight of the bench, the badge, and the system itself. Yet, for the first time, it wasn't her who looked out of place. It was them. You really came in here thinking I'd just fold, didn't you? Olivia Carson said quietly. It wasn't provoke. It was to state what was now clear to everyone. Officer Reynolds stiffened in the witness chair, his fingers tightening around the wooden armrests. His uniform, which a moment ago commanded silent respect, now looked more like a costume, pressed, polished, and empty. Judge Samuel Hayes hadn't moved since he last spoke, but his eyes remained locked on Reynolds. His stillness wasn't passive. It was loaded, like a storm cloud holding back the rain. The gallery sat motionless, sensing the change in the air. The courtroom, once entirely controlled by intimidation, had turned into something else. It was no longer a place of performance. It had become a crucible. Olivia Carson took a step closer, her voice now carrying more weight. I'm not questioning whether you've seen violations before. I'm questioning whether you documented one this time. And the answer is no. Reynolds opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. I know what I saw, he muttered. I don't need a damn camera to confirm it. Maybe not, Olivia Carson replied evenly, but the law does. That was a cut, quiet, precise, and it landed harder than a raised voice ever could. Judge Porter leaned forward suddenly, trying to regain control. Miss Carson, this is not a cross-examination. You've made your point. Olivia Carson didn't back down. My point, Your Honor, is that you find me based on nothing but a man's memory. No photos, no timestamps, no corroboration, just his belief. That's not evidence. That's presumption. Richard's lips pressed into a thin, trembling line, his hand reaching for the gavel. But Samuel Hayes shifted in his chair, stopping him without a word. Let her finish, Samuel Hayes said, his voice barely louder than a whisper, but it echoed through the room like thunder. Olivia Carson turned back to the gallery. Her voice softened now, less legal, more human. I'm not the only one this has happened to. I know that, and so do a lot of people in this room. I've seen it in every hallway outside these courts, in waiting rooms filled with people who didn't get to speak, who couldn't afford to argue, who paid the fine just to move on. She paused, her eyes scanning the room. They didn't have a folder full of precedent. They didn't have the time or the training to fight back. They just disappeared under the weight of it. A low murmur moved through the gallery. This wasn't courtroom drama anymore. This was truth, ugly, quiet truth. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. I was just doing my job. Olivia Carson's voice was slow, deliberate. Your job, Officer Reynolds, is to serve the people, not... Samuel's expression remained unchanged, but something in his posture relaxed ever so slightly, a silent acknowledgement. Olivia Carson took this as a confirmation. She turned back toward the bench, addressing both judges now. I'd like to enter into the record the case of Lozano versus City of Norfolk, 2021, she said. A similar citation was overturned due to lack of documentation. The appellate court stated, and I quote, "No enforcement action can be upheld without a trail of objective evidence. Otherwise, we validate enforcement by memory, not measurement." She walked back to her table, unfolding another sheet. Also, Travis versus Clark County, 2020. A fine of $10,000 was vacated when the court ruled that citation-based penalties must meet the same evidentiary threshold as criminal misdemeanors if the punishment exceeds $1,000. She placed both cases on the table, then turned and looked directly at Judge Porter. You levied a fine 15 times that amount without a single document, and you called it justice? Porter opened his mouth, but this time it wasn't Olivia Carson who shut him down. It was Samuel. Judge Breener, Samuel said, his voice cold and level. Did you request to see Officer Reynolds' supporting documentation before issuing your ruling? The silence that followed was long, too long. No, Porter finally muttered. The courtroom didn't gasp. It didn't need to. The damage was already done. Then, on what basis? Samuel asked, leaning forward. Did you find the citation to be valid? I trusted the officer's report, Porter said, but the words were empty. There was no report, Samuel replied. Porter's eyes flicked downward. I assumed it had been filed. That was it. The twist, the moment of collapse. He hadn't seen the evidence because there wasn't any. And now, for the first time, the judge who had once barked orders with impunity was exposed. Not just as biased, but as careless, reckless. Olivia Carson didn't smile. She didn't gloat, but her voice carried weight as she spoke her next words. When courts stop asking for proof, they stop being courts. They become something else, something dangerous. Samuel turned back to her. You may proceed. Olivia opened a final folder. I'm entering a motion to vacate the fine in full on the basis of constitutional due process violations and lack of evidentiary support. No one spoke for a full 15 seconds. It was a kind of silence that felt like a verdict in itself. Then, slowly, Samuel nodded. Motion entered. Reynolds exhaled sharply and stood as if trying to leave the stand, but Samuel raised a hand. "Officer Reynolds, remain seated. We're not finished." And just like that, the man who had once walked with the swagger of unchallenged authority now sat like a student waiting for discipline. Olivia Carson returned to her seat, not out of exhaustion, but out of purpose. She had shifted the balance of the room, and she knew it. But what she didn't know yet was that the most important witness hadn't even entered the courtroom. Not yet. When the side door creaked open again, every head in the courtroom turned. A woman stepped in, middle-aged, modestly dressed in a tan skirt suit, carrying a leather portfolio hugged tightly to her chest. She looked nervous, unsure, almost out of place in the imposing space of courtroom 4B. "Who is she?" someone whispered from the gallery. Olivia Carson didn't blink because she knew exactly who had just walked in. "Your Honor," Olivia Carson said, rising, with, "If the court's permission, I'd like to call Ms. Lorraine Dukes to the stand." Judge Porter looked stunned. "Who?" he asked, clearly taken aback. Samuel raised an eyebrow but gestured toward the witness chair. "Proceed." The bailiff guided Ms. Dukes forward, her heels clicking softly on the linoleum as she walked toward the stand. Her hands were shaking as she took the oath, and she sat gently, almost as if afraid the chair might collapse beneath her. "Please state your name for the record," Olivia Carson said gently. "Lorraine Dukes," she replied, her voice quiet, worn. "And what is your occupation?" "I'm retired now. I used to clean municipal buildings, janitorial contractor." Olivia Carson nodded. "Do you recognize Officer Reynolds?" Lorraine looked up, locking eyes with the man sitting stiffly at the side of the courtroom, her lips pressed together, and she gave the smallest of nods. "Yes. He wrote me a citation last year." "What for?" "He said my truck was parked on the curb in a restricted zone while I was unloading equipment. I tried to explain it was a designated loading area, but he cut me off and handed me a ticket right there." "Did you contest the ticket?" Lorraine hesitated. "I tried. I came to court just like this, but I didn't know how to fight it. I didn't have any documents or photos. No one asked for any either. And the outcome, they fined me $9,000, said I was operating illegally on city property. I couldn't afford the appeal. I had to shut my business down." Gasps echoed across the gallery. Olivia Carson turned toward the bench. "Your Honors, this is not a singular issue. This is a pattern. Officer Reynolds has issued over 24 citations without evidence over the past 18 months. Many of them against contractors, small business owners, and disproportionately against black and immigrant residents." Samuel turned to Porter. "Were you presiding over Ms. Dukes' hearing?" Porter didn't respond immediately, then quietly said, "Yes." "Did you request supporting documents before issuing the fine?" "No." That answer landed like a blow to the ribs. Olivia Carson stepped forward, her voice rising, not in volume, but in clarity. "This courtroom has been operating like a rubber stamp for unchecked authority. People like Ms. Dukes, people without representation, without money, walked in here expecting justice. Instead, they were punished without proof." Samuel leaned forward, his fingers interlocked. "Do you have records of these citations?" Olivia Carson nodded. "Yes, 17 of them. I filed a FOIA request with the city 3 weeks ago. The clerk's office stonewalled me, but I kept pushing. When I finally got the data, it confirmed what I suspected." She walked back to her table, lifted a folder, and placed it squarely on the evidence table. "This file includes every citation Officer Reynolds issued under Code 32C. 80% had no accompanying photos, no timestamps, no reports. And in every one, the fine was upheld." Breener's face turned a deep shade of red. "You went digging through municipal records," he said, his voice sharp. "I went looking for truth," Olivia Carson replied, "and I found a system that's been exploiting silence." She turned toward Reynolds. "You've been operating with impunity. You issue a ticket, walk away, and never think about the damage you leave behind. But Ms. Dukes, she lost everything." Lorraine's eyes shimmered, and her voice cracked when she whispered, "I almost lost my home." The gallery shifted again, the energy buzzing like electricity. The courtroom wasn't a place of fear anymore. It had become a stage for truth. Porter tried one last time to assert control. Miss Carson, you're not here. I'm not here to litigate the entire municipal court system, Olivia Carson said, her voice steady and unwavering. No, Judge, she continued. I'm here to reveal what happens when no one does. Samuel tapped his pen once on the bench. This court, he said slowly, will now recess for 20 minutes while I review the submitted records. As he stood, the courtroom practically exhaled. Porter rose as well, more slowly this time, his robe dragging behind him like a heavy cloak. Olivia Carson remained still, not moving until the door to the chambers clicked shut behind him. Only then did she turn to Ms. Dukes and reach for her hand. You're not invisible anymore, Olivia Carson said, her voice soft but firm. Lorraine nodded through her tears. You don't know what this means. Olivia Carson gave her a quiet smile. I do, because this wasn't just about a single fine. This was about accountability long overdue. And she wasn't done, not by a long shot. The moment the courtroom doors swung open again, something had shifted. Judge Samuel Hayes walked in first, his eyes steady, his posture stiff. His face gave nothing away, but the silence that followed him was telling. Even Judge Porter seemed to move differently now. His shoulders lower, his steps heavier, his usual bluster stripped away by a truth he could no longer bury. Olivia Carson stood as they entered, but she didn't speak. She didn't have to. She had already delivered her blow, and the evidence she'd laid out was still rippling through the room. Samuel adjusted his robe and cleared his throat. This court has reviewed the documents submitted during recess, including citation records, officer documentation logs, and internal procedure reports. He paused, looking down at the bench, then directly at Reynolds. Officer Reynolds, can you explain why so many of your citations lack corresponding documentation? Reynolds shifted in his chair. Sir, most of those situations were straightforward. I've been issuing these types of violations for years. We were told verbal confirmation and visual assessment were acceptable. By whom? Samuel asked, his eyes locked on him. There was a pause. Reynolds looked toward Porter, then down at his lap. I don't recall specific instruction. Samuel's voice sharpened. That's a convenient lapse in memory. Olivia Carson took one step forward, her voice cutting through the silence. Your Honor, if I may, this wasn't just carelessness. This was coordinated convenience. A system where no one had to prove anything as long as the right people looked the other way. The courtroom stilled again. Every word she said seemed to cut deeper, because no one could deny the picture forming. A courtroom that looked official on the outside but operated more like a silent machine, churning out fines without challenge, lives without appeal. I'd like to call one more witness, Olivia Carson continued. Porter jolted, his eyes widening. This is not a trial. Samuel raised a hand, silencing him without a word. Proceed, he said. Olivia Carson nodded toward the back. The doors opened once more, and this time, a man in a navy blue suit entered. He was clean-cut and calm, a briefcase in hand. He looked like any mid-level administrator, until he spoke. Name and occupation for the record? Olivia Carson asked. Darren Lowe, former records analyst for the Silver Creek Municipal Compliance Division. Former? I resigned 3 weeks ago. Olivia Carson nodded, her eyes narrowing. And can you tell the court why? Lowe glanced briefly at the bench, then back at her. Because I was instructed repeatedly not to flag inconsistencies in documentation, especially from Officer Reynolds. Gasps swept the gallery. Porter shifted uncomfortably in his seat, color draining from his face. Instructed by whom? Olivia Carson asked, her voice calm but piercing. Lowe hesitated, then responded, Chief Enforcement Supervisor, but those reports were escalated through Judge Breener's office. The silence that followed was electric. Porter stood abruptly, his face red with frustration. This is ridiculous. You're relying on hearsay from a disgruntled employee. Lowe didn't flinch. I have emails time-stamped and archived. Olivia's eyes never left Porter. Would you like them entered into evidence now? Porter froze, momentarily speechless. Samuel turned slowly toward him, his voice quieter this time, but colder. Judge Porter, do you deny that your office received these reports? I don't recall specifics. Samuel's voice sharpened. That seems to be a pattern today. A chuckle rippled through the gallery, not loud, but laced with contempt. Olivia Carson leaned forward, her voice steady and clear. Your honors, we're no longer talking about a mistaken fine. We are standing in the aftermath of a deliberate system, one that operated on silence, intimidation, and the assumption that no one would ever connect the dots. She placed a folder gently on the table beside her, but I connected them. Samuel glanced over the bench one last time. This court will take a 15-minute recess before delivering its decision. As he stood, Porter did too, but this time there was no authority in his posture, no fire in his voice, only quiet dread. The doors closed behind them, and the room exhaled once more. Olivia Carson sat back down, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed straight ahead. Beside her, Darren Lowe leaned in slightly. You think they'll take it seriously? He asked. She didn't look at him when she answered. They won't have a choice. 15 minutes had never felt so long. The courtroom stayed unusually quiet during the recess. No one left. No one spoke above a whisper. It wasn't just suspense. It was reverence. Everyone knew something irreversible had just unfolded, and now they were waiting for a verdict that wouldn't only affect Olivia Carson. It would redefine everything this courtroom stood for. Olivia Carson sat still at the defense table, her eyes closed for a moment, not to rest but to focus. Her heart wasn't pounding anymore, not after the hours she had already endured. Now it was clarity, sharp, steady, surgical. The system had been exposed, but exposure was enough. She needed consequence. Across the room, Officer Reynolds no longer carried the posture of confidence. His shoulders were hunched, his lips tight. One hand anxiously rubbed his thumb against his palm. His lawyer, who had arrived mid-recess, sat beside him, whispering harshly in his ear. But there was no fixing what had already been said on record. And Porter hadn't returned yet. When the doors opened again, it wasn't just the judges who entered. It was the weight of accountability. Samuel walked in first, composed as ever. But behind him, Judge Porter looked visibly shaken. His gait was slower, his movements heavier. The silence that followed wasn't respect. It was suspicion. Samuel took his seat, his eyes scanning the room like a lighthouse beam. When he finally spoke, the air in the room thinned. This court has reviewed all submitted documentation, including testimonial transcripts, citation records, and internal communications from a municipal compliance division. He paused. The findings are deeply concerning. A ripple moved through the gallery. No gasps, just tension thickening like storm clouds. This case began with a single fine, one citation, but it has revealed a pattern of behavior that calls into question the integrity of this courtroom's recent practices. Samuel turned to Olivia Carson. Miss Carson, your motion to vacate the $15,000 fine is granted. A breath was released, one collective exhale across the room, but Samuel wasn't finished. In addition, he continued, the court is initiating a formal inquiry into the use of Officer Reynolds' citations as grounds for punitive financial penalties. All prior rulings involving Code 32C will be reviewed within the next 30 days. Reynolds' attorney stood abruptly. Your Honor, my client wasn't prepared. Samuel didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. This court doesn't require preparation to recognize injustice. We require truth. He then turned to Porter. And as to the court's prior oversight, we will be referring all related matters to the State Judicial Review Board for further investigation. The room exploded, not in noise but in energy. The gallery leaned forward. Dozens of eyes locked on Porter, who now looked like a man sitting on broken glass. Olivia Carson stood. Your Honor, before we adjourn, I'd like to place one final exhibit into the record. Samuel gestured. Go ahead. She pulled out a manila envelope, slid out a printed photograph, and held it up for the court to see. It was Lorraine Dukes, standing in front of what had once been her small cleaning van. Now, the lot was empty, the van repossessed, and chains still hung across the driveway. This is what happens, Olivia Carson said, her voice catching slightly, when silence replaces evidence, when convenience becomes policy, and when courts forget who they were built to serve. Her words didn't rise, but they hit deeper than any outburst could. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who stood in this courtroom without the training or resources to defend themselves. People who were told, pay the fine and move on. But moving on isn't justice. It's surrender. She placed a photo on the evidence table and looked straight at Samuel. I didn't come here to make noise. I came here to make change. And now the record reflects why. Samuel leaned back. His expression hadn't changed, but his silence carried weight. He turned toward the gallery, addressing them directly. This courtroom belongs to the people, not to the powerful. Let that be remembered going forward. With a single strike of the gavel, the room was dismissed. Olivia Carson gathered her papers quietly. She didn't smile, didn't celebrate. This wasn't the finish line. It was a fracture point. As the gallery began to file out, whispers spread like wildfire. A woman stepped forward. "Lorraine Dukes," she asked. "They're going to investigate him?" Olivia Carson nodded. "They already are." Lorraine's eyes watered. "You didn't just fight for yourself." Olivia looked around at the emptying courtroom, then back at Lorraine. None of us are ever just fighting for ourselves. In the back of the room, someone reached for their phone and started filming as they walked past a bench. Not for drama, but for history. What happened today wasn't just a moment. It was a movement beginning to take shape, and it had a name now: accountability. Olivia Carson stepped outside the courthouse into the brisk Silver Creek air. The wind whipped her blazer, as if trying to slow her down, but nothing could. Not after what just unfolded in courtroom 4B. The press was already gathering. A few reporters called her name, microphones extended, cameras rolling. She offered a polite, "No comment for now," and kept walking. This wasn't about headlines. Not yet. She had one more stop to make. A black sedan was already idling at the curb, waiting for her. As she opened the door and slid inside, the driver greeted her. An older man in a wool coat and newsboy cap glanced at Olivia Carson in the rearview mirror. "They're all talking about you inside," he said with a quiet smile. "First time I've seen that courtroom rattled in 20 years. Olivia gave a tired nod. "Let's go downtown. I have a meeting." As the car pulled away, she checked her folder again. Inside was a document no one in that courtroom had seen yet. A sealed affidavit, signed, notarized, and capable of bringing down more than just a corrupt judge. She wasn't done. Not even close. 20 minutes later, she stepped into a modest office building tucked between two warehouses on the south side. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and walls were lined with file boxes. Behind a desk sat a woman in a navy sweater, typing rapidly. She looked up as Olivia entered. "You're early," the woman said. "Wasn't expecting you until tomorrow." "I couldn't wait," Olivia Carson replied. "Do you still have access to the city's contract records?" The woman hesitated. "Depends on what you're looking for." Olivia placed a sealed affidavit on the desk. "This," she said, "is a sworn statement from a former clerk in the compliance division. It alleges that Judge Porter personally intervened in over 24 enforcement cases where city-owned properties were being sold at below market rates after the owners were fined out of them." The woman's eyes widened. "You think he was flipping properties?" "I think he was burying people under fines, then letting them default, and someone was waiting on the other side to scoop up the remains." The silence stretched. Olivia leaned in, her voice lower now. "I don't just want to clear past violations. I want the pipeline exposed. Every case, every name." The woman nodded slowly. "I can pull what I can, but it'll take time." Olivia exhaled. "Then let's get to work." Back at the courthouse, Judge Porter was sitting alone in his chambers. His desk was covered in papers, some marked with red notes from the Judicial Review Board. He hadn't touched his coffee, hadn't touched anything. There was a knock at the door. His assistant peeked in, her face pale. "Judge, Samuel's office just sent over their preliminary report," she said. "They're requesting you step down pending investigation." Breener's hand trembled as he reached for the folder. He had thought this was just another hearing, a routine fine, another day of wielding unchecked power behind the safety of his robe. He hadn't realized the woman in front of him was already 3 steps ahead. And now, she had left behind wreckage that would follow him far beyond the bench. Back across town, Olivia Carson sat in a community center gymnasium. It was quiet, save for the buzz of fluorescent lights and the soft chatter of volunteers folding flyers at a nearby table. An older man stepped onto the stage and cleared his throat. "We didn't expect her to say yes," he told the small crowd. "We just hoped." Then he turned to Olivia. "But when you came to us, not as a lawyer, but as someone who cared, we knew something had changed." Olivia took the mic, her voice humble but unshaken. "This fight doesn't end with dismissed fine," she said. "It ends when every person who's been silenced by a broken system has the tools to stand back up." Someone in the back shouted, "What's next?" Olivia Carson smiled. "Next, we make sure they can't ignore us anymore." Sure, the system never forgets what happens when you underestimate the people you were supposed to serve. As the applause grew louder, Olivia Carson stood tall, not as a lawyer defending her own name, but as a voice for the voiceless, sharpening the blade of truth in the face of a system built to dull it. Outside, the sky had darkened, but a single beam of sunlight broke through the clouds. It wasn't a metaphor, it was a warning. Change had arrived, and it was wearing heels and a courtroom badge. 2 weeks later, courtroom 4B didn't look the same. The heavy tension that once hung in the air had lifted. The seats were packed, not with defendants, but with reporters, community leaders, and young law students. A new judge presided now. Breener's nameplate was gone, his chair replaced. A quiet symbol of accountability that no one dared acknowledge aloud. But everyone noticed. Olivia Carson stood near the gallery, not at the defense table this time, but beside a folding podium. Her blouse was neatly pressed, her badge clipped to her belt. Not as a public defender, but as a newly appointed deputy legal oversight officer for the city's civil integrity unit. It wasn't promotion she asked for, it was one she earned. Across from her, Judge Samuel Hayes stood at the bench, watching as a small group of citizens took seats behind microphones. They were there to give testimony, not as defendants, but as voices of the public, invited for the first time in years to speak into a courtroom that had once refused to listen. Samuel looked toward Olivia Carson and gave a slight nod. "The floor is yours, Miss Carson." She stepped up to the mic, unfolding a simple sheet of paper. But instead of reading from it, she looked out into the crowd and then folded it back up. "Justice isn't a one-time verdict," she began. "It's a habit, a culture, a muscle we build, not by punishing the guilty alone, but by protecting the vulnerable." She turned slightly toward the camera crew in the back of the room. "I stood here weeks ago, accused of violating a city ordinance. I was fined $15,000 without a shred of evidence, without a voice, without a hearing. And I wasn't the first." Murmurs rippled through the audience. "I was lucky," she continued. "I had a law degree, I had experience, and I had people who could help me fight back. But what about the ones who didn't? What about the small business owners, veterans, single parents, who were fined into silence, whose lives were disrupted, whose dignity was stripped without cause?" She looked back at the gallery. "I've spent the last 14 days with a team, combing through 5 years' worth of municipal fines. We found over 400 cases issued without proper evidence. Over 100 were under Breener's direct supervision. That's not a clerical error. That's a crisis." From the gallery, Lorraine Dukes raised a hand. She didn't speak. She just nodded. Across the aisle, Darren Lowe did the same. "I'm not here today to celebrate a win," Olivia Carson said. "I'm here to call for reform, permanent, enforceable change. Every citation must include physical evidence. Every defendant must be offered legal counsel, and every courtroom must remember who it exists to serve." Samuel folded his hands, his expression unreadable. A young girl sitting in the back row, a high school student from West Philly, no older than 17, leaned forward, listening like her future depended on every word. Olivia Carson saw her and smiled, because power doesn't just show up in the form of a badge or a robe. Sometimes it shows up as a whisper in a courtroom, reminding people they're not alone. She stepped away from the mic. The applause started small, a few claps, then more, then a standing ovation that swept through the room, not because of victory, but because of recognition. because Justice had finally looked like someone they knew. Outside, as she exited the building, a crowd was waiting, not with picket signs, but with clipboards, cameras, and hope. Someone shoved a mic in her direction. "Miss Carson, how does it feel to take down a judge?" She paused and smiled gently. "I didn't take down a judge," she said. "I stood up for the people he forgot." The reporter blinked, stunned by the answer. Behind her, the courthouse doors closed, but some had been left wide open. A movement, a message, and a warning. Because justice wasn't just restored that day. It was redefined. And to every viewer watching this now, remember, stories like Olivia's aren't fiction. For many people in this country, the fight for fairness isn't over. It's happening every day in rooms like this one. The people who never get the mic. So if the story moved you, if it made you think, or made you feel seen, like, comment, and share it. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories where truth meets justice. Because the more we speak out, the louder we become, and one day, the system won't just hear us, it will listen.